Hey guys, tonight we journey back to the quiet villages and muddy streets of Puritan America, a world where every action was watched, every word carried weight, and even the smallest mistake could lead to a punishment that seems almost unbelievable today. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights, get comfortable beneath a blanket, and allow yourself to drift back through the centuries. Tonight, we are traveling to a time when law, religion, and daily life were woven together so tightly that separating them was almost impossible. If you enjoy these journeys into forgotten history, don't forget to like the video and subscribe. And now, let's begin. The year is 1630. Across the cold waters of the Atlantic Ocean, small wooden ships arrive along the shores of New England. The passengers are tired after months at sea. Many have lost friends and family during the journey. Yet, they believe they have come to a special place. These settlers are known as Puritans. They are not simply searching for land or wealth. They are trying to build what they see as a godly society, a community that follows strict religious principles and serves as an example to the world. To modern eyes, their villages might seem peaceful. Small wooden houses stand beside dirt roads. Smoke rises from chimneys during chilly mornings. Fields stretch toward dark forests. Church bells call residents together every week. Yet beneath this calm appearance lies a system of rules, unlike anything most people experience today. The Puritans believed that sin was not merely a personal matter. If one person behaved badly, the entire community could suffer God's punishment. A drought, a poor harvest, or an outbreak of disease might be interpreted as evidence that someone had allowed wickedness to enter the settlement. Because of this belief, maintaining order became everyone's responsibility. Neighbors watched neighbors. Families watched family members. Church leaders watched entire communities. Privacy, as we understand it today, barely existed. In many Puritan towns, daily life followed a predictable pattern. People woke before sunrise. They worked in fields, workshops, kitchens, and barns. Children were expected to contribute from an early age. Idleness was considered dangerous. A person who appeared lazy risked attracting suspicion. Hard work was not merely encouraged. It was viewed as a religious duty. The laws reflected these values. Many regulations seem surprising to modern readers. Some addressed serious crimes. Others targeted behavior that today might hardly attract attention. Speaking disrespectfully to parents could result in punishment. Skipping church services could result in punishment. Public drunkenness could result in punishment. Even certain forms of entertainment could be viewed as dangerous distractions from religious devotion. To understand why punishments became so unusual, it helps to understand how Puritans viewed human nature. They believed people were naturally inclined toward sin. Without constant discipline, temptation could spread. The purpose of punishment was not only to correct the offender, it was also meant to warn everyone else. A punishment performed in public became a lesson. The entire town was expected to observe and remember. One of the most common punishments involved something called the stocks. Today, many people have seen illustrations of stocks in history books. The device was simple. A wooden frame contained holes for a person's head and hands. Once locked inside, movement became difficult. The offender would then be placed in a public area, perhaps near the meeting house, perhaps beside a busy road, perhaps in the center of town. The discomfort was only part of the punishment. Humiliation was often the greater goal. As neighbors walked past, they could stare, they could whisper, sometimes they could mock. The offender became a visible example of what happened when rules were broken. Imagine spending hours unable to move comfortably while everyone in your community observed you. For many Puritans, shame carried tremendous power. Reputation mattered. A person's standing in society could influence friendships, business relationships, marriage prospects, and social trust. Public embarrassment could leave lasting scars. The stocks were therefore remarkably effective. Yet they were only the beginning. Another punishment was the pillory. At first glance, it resembled the stocks. However, the experience could be even harsher. The offender's head and hands were secured in a raised wooden framework. Unlike the stocks, the person often stood while restrained. This increased physical discomfort over time. Crowds gathered around pillories. The reactions varied. Some observers remained quiet. Others expressed anger. Occasionally, people threw rotten vegetables, mud, or other unpleasant objects. Although officials did not always encourage such behavior, they frequently tolerated it. Public punishment was meant to provoke a response. The community itself became part of the process. The pillory transformed justice into a public spectacle. Yet what modern observers often find most surprising is how many offenses could result in these penalties. Counterfeiting, blasphemy, fraud, dishonest business practices, repeated disruptive behavior. Each could potentially bring a person before the community. The Puritans believed visible consequences reinforced moral standards. As a result, punishments were designed to be remembered. One particular case from colonial New England involved a man accused of spreading false information about local authorities. Today, people might think of gossip as annoying, but relatively minor. Puritan leaders viewed it differently. False accusations could damage trust within the settlement. Since unity was considered essential for survival, harmful rumors were treated seriously. The accused man spent hours exposed before his neighbors. Long after the punishment ended, many residents remembered the incident. That memory was part of the intended outcome. The lesson lingered. During this period, written records reveal a fascinating detail. Many punishments focused less on physical injury than on public exposure. Officials wanted wrongdoing to be visible. A secret punishment could not educate the community. A hidden correction could not strengthen social discipline. Visibility was essential. People needed to witness the consequences. This philosophy influenced countless aspects of colonial life. Even clothing sometimes reflected moral expectations. Puritan leaders worried about excessive displays of wealth. They feared luxury, encouraged pride. In some colonies, regulations attempted to control what certain people could wear. Expensive fabrics and decorative items occasionally attracted criticism. The goal was not simply economic, it was moral. Society, they believed, functioned best when modesty prevailed. For newcomers arriving from Europe, adapting to these expectations could be difficult. Different regions possessed different customs. What seemed normal in one place might appear improper in another. Conflicts inevitably emerged. Court records reveal disagreements over behavior, speech, clothing, business practices, and religious observance. Many cases that appear trivial today generated significant concern. Behind each dispute stood a larger fear. Leaders worried that disorder might spread. The settlements themselves remained fragile. Harsh winters threatened survival. Crop failures created uncertainty. Disease outbreaks remained common. Relations with neighboring groups could be tense. In such an environment, stability felt precious. Anything that endangered social cohesion attracted attention. Punishments therefore served multiple purposes. They enforced laws. They reinforced religious teachings. They promoted conformity. And perhaps most importantly, they reassured anxious communities that order remained intact. As decades passed, some punishments became increasingly elaborate. Officials searched for methods that would maximize deterrence without necessarily resorting to extreme violence. This search produced devices and penalties that seem strange today. Some involved signs. Some involved public confessions. Others involved highly visible symbols designed to mark an individual's offense. Among the most notorious examples was a punishment that forced offenders to carry evidence of their wrongdoing wherever they went. Unlike the stocks or pillory, this penalty could continue long after the courtroom proceedings ended. Its effects followed a person through daily life. Every conversation, every errand, every church gathering, every interaction became a reminder. And in a society where reputation meant everything, that reminder could be devastating. The story of those punishments would become one of the most unusual chapters in Puritan America, and it is there that our journey will continue next time. The punishment did not end when a person walked away from the courtroom. In many cases, that was only the beginning. The offender returned home, but the community remembered. Every glance, every whisper, and every conversation could carry traces of what had happened. In Puritan America, reputation was a kind of currency. Once damaged, restoring it could take years. One of the most unusual methods used by colonial authorities involved forcing individuals to wear visible symbols of their offenses. The idea was simple. If punishment remained visible, the lesson remained visible as well, rather than locking someone away where nobody could see them. Authorities preferred a consequence that followed the person through daily life. The offender became a walking reminder of the rules. The most famous example emerged in Massachusetts, Bay Colony, although later generations would become familiar with the image through literature. The real practice grew from actual Puritan attitudes toward public shame. People accused of certain moral offenses could be required to publicly acknowledge their wrongdoing. Sometimes this involved standing before the congregation during church services. Sometimes it involved wearing identifying marks or signs. To modern observers, this might seem cruel. To Puritan leaders, however, shame served an important purpose. They believed genuine repentance required humility. A person who openly admitted wrongdoing demonstrated a willingness to accept responsibility. The community, in theory, could eventually forgive, but forgiveness rarely arrived quickly. Imagine entering a crowded meeting house on a Sunday morning. The room is silent, except for the sound of wooden benches creaking beneath the congregation. Every face turns toward you. Everyone knows why you are standing there. Everyone knows what you did. There is no hiding, no anonymity, no opportunity to blend into the crowd. Such experiences could be deeply uncomfortable, yet they were common enough to appear repeatedly in colonial records. Church discipline often worked alongside civil punishment. A person might face consequences from local authorities, and then face additional scrutiny from religious leaders. The boundaries between church and government remained remarkably blurred. In many Puritan communities, the same men who held political influence also occupied important religious positions. As a result, moral behavior and legal behavior frequently overlapped. Another strange punishment involved written confessions. Authorities sometimes required offenders to prepare statements admitting their actions. These confessions could be read publicly. The purpose was not merely to establish guilt. The purpose was to create an example. Listeners heard the confession. They reflected upon it. Ideally, they adjusted their own behavior accordingly. The system relied heavily upon social pressure, and social pressure was everywhere. Consider the size of many settlements. Some towns contained only a few hundred residents. Others remained even smaller. People knew one another. Families interacted repeatedly over decades. A mistake rarely disappeared into the past. News traveled quickly. Stories traveled even faster. If a farmer violated a local regulation, Neighbors learned about it. If a merchant cheated customers, word spread. If a resident behaved in a manner considered improper, discussions often followed. This environment made public punishments especially powerful. The audience was not a crowd of strangers. It was the offender's entire social world. Friends, relatives, business partners, future marriage prospects. Everyone watched. One curious example involved individuals accused of excessive gossip. Puritan authorities worried that rumors could create division within communities. Words mattered. A careless statement could damage reputations or provoke conflict. Court records reveal numerous cases involving slander and defamation. Sometimes fines were imposed. Sometimes apologies were required. Occasionally, offenders endured public humiliation. The seriousness with which gossip was treated may surprise modern readers. Yet, from the Puritan perspective, social harmony was essential. Small settlements depended upon cooperation. Distrust threatened survival. As a result, harmful speech attracted attention. Another category of punishment focused on Sabbath violations. The Sabbath occupied a central place in Puritan life. Sunday was intended for worship, reflection, and religious instruction. Activities viewed as distractions could lead to trouble. Different colonies enforced these expectations with varying degrees of strictness. People might face penalties for unnecessary labor. Travel could attract scrutiny. Recreational activities sometimes generated complaints. Records describe investigations into behavior that modern societies would consider ordinary weekend activities. Puritan leaders feared that relaxing Sabbath standards would encourage broader moral decline. One small exception might become another, then another. Eventually, they worried religious discipline would disappear entirely. For that reason, even seemingly minor violations received attention. Children also lived under these expectations. Colonial childhood differed significantly from modern childhood. Young people worked. They contributed to household economies. They learned religious lessons from an early age. Disobedience was viewed seriously. Parents possessed substantial authority. Schools emphasized discipline. Teachers frequently relied upon punishments intended to encourage obedience. Some classrooms employed methods that seem harsh today. Students who disrupted lessons or failed to meet expectations could experience embarrassment before their peers. The goal remained familiar: correct behavior through public accountability. As years passed, the legal records of New England accumulated countless examples of such practices. Each case offers a glimpse into a society attempting to balance order, faith, and survival. Not every resident agreed with every punishment. Complaints occasionally surfaced. Disputes occurred. Some individuals challenged accusations. Others argued their innocence. Courtrooms became arenas where competing versions of events collided. Witnesses testified, neighbors provided statements, magistrates weighed evidence. The resulting records survive centuries later. Through them, historians can reconstruct daily life with remarkable detail. One recurring theme appears again and again. Puritan authorities feared disorder. That fear influenced nearly every aspect of governance. The memory of religious conflict in Europe remained fresh. Many settlers had crossed the Atlantic partly because of disagreements over faith and church practices. They believed they were creating a better society. Protecting that vision became a priority. When leaders encountered behavior they considered threatening, they often responded forcefully. Punishments reflected those concerns, yet some of the strangest consequences were still ahead. Among them was a device that targeted one particular problem: people who talked too much, or more specifically, people accused of speaking in ways authorities disliked. The existence of such a punishment sounds almost unbelievable today, yet historical records show that versions of it appeared in English traditions and influenced practices in colonial America. The device would become infamous: heavy, uncomfortable, humiliating, designed not merely to punish speech, but to physically control it. Its very name would survive for centuries as a symbol of social discipline. And as our journey through Puritan America continues, we will soon encounter this remarkable and unsettling instrument, along with the stories of the people who found themselves subjected to it. The quiet villages of New England still appear peaceful from a distance. Church steeples rise above fields. Wood smoke drifts through the air. Farmers tend livestock. Children run along muddy paths. Yet beneath that calm surface exists a world governed by strict expectations and unusual consequences. A world where every action mattered. A world where every word could carry consequences. And a world where punishment often depended as much upon public opinion as upon the law itself. That is where our story continues. The idea that words could threaten an entire community may sound strange today, but in Puritan America, speech carried enormous power. A careless accusation could damage a family's standing. A rumor could divide neighbors. A criticism aimed at a church leader might undermine authority. Because communities were small and deeply interconnected, words often traveled farther than intended. This concern about speech was not unique to New England. The Puritans inherited many legal traditions from England, and among those traditions was a punishment so unusual that it seems almost impossible to modern readers. It was known as the scold's bridle. The device was made of metal and fitted around the head like a cage. A metal plate or spike extended into the mouth, pressing down on the tongue. The wearer could barely speak. Any attempt to talk became uncomfortable and sometimes painful. The punishment was intended primarily for individuals accused of being common scolds, a legal term used in England for people considered habitually argumentative, disruptive, or troublesome through speech. Women were far more likely to be targeted by this accusation than men. The practice reflected the social attitudes of the era. Authorities often viewed outspoken behavior by women differently than similar behavior by men. Modern historians frequently point to this punishment as an example of the unequal standards that existed within colonial society. Although documented use of the scold's bridle was more common in Britain than in New England, the ideas behind it influenced colonial attitudes toward controlling speech and public behavior. The very existence of such a device reveals how seriously authorities regarded words. Today, disagreement is often considered a normal part of public life. For many Puritan leaders, however, open conflict represented a potential threat to social stability. A peaceful community required obedience. Obedience required restraint, and restraint extended even to conversation. Yet not all punishments relied upon physical devices. Some relied entirely upon public exposure. One particularly memorable example involved offenders being forced to stand before their neighbors while displaying signs describing their crimes. Imagine walking through a village center and seeing someone standing alone, wearing a placard around their neck. The sign announces their offense for everyone to read. Perhaps it accuses them of dishonesty. Perhaps it identifies them as a thief. Perhaps it reveals some other violation of local rules. The message was immediate. Everyone passing by understood exactly why the person was there. No explanation was needed. No secrecy remained. In a culture where reputation shaped nearly every aspect of life, such punishments could be devastating. People depended upon trust. Merchants needed customers. Farmers relied upon cooperation from neighbors. Families sought respectable marriage opportunities for their children. Damage to one's reputation could influence all of these relationships. For this reason, public shame often achieved what authorities intended. Many offenders desperately wished to avoid repeating the experience. The same philosophy appeared in another unusual punishment: public confession before the congregation. The church occupied the center of Puritan society. Attendance was expected. Weekly services lasted for hours. Important announcements were delivered there. Community disputes sometimes became known there. When a person was required to confess publicly, the audience included virtually everyone who mattered in local life. The individual stood before relatives, friends, employers, and neighbors. Then came the confession. Sometimes it was brief, sometimes it was lengthy, but regardless of its length, the purpose remained the same. The offender acknowledged wrongdoing before the community. Only afterward could the process of forgiveness begin. Whether forgiveness truly followed varied from case to case. Human nature remained human nature. People remembered. Some mistakes lingered in public memory for years. Court records occasionally reveal individuals still associated with past offenses long after punishments officially ended. The shadow of disgrace could stretch across decades. As settlements expanded during the 17th century, authorities faced a growing challenge. New arrivals brought different customs. Trade increased. Communities became more complex. Maintaining uniform behavior grew increasingly difficult. Leaders responded by reinforcing laws they believed protected moral order. One area that attracted particular attention was alcohol. Contrary to popular assumptions, Puritans did not oppose alcohol itself. Beer, cider, and other drinks were common. What concerned authorities was drunkenness. Excessive drinking threatened self-control. A drunken individual might fight, neglect responsibilities, or behave in ways considered sinful. As a result, public intoxication frequently appeared in court records. Punishments varied. Fines were common. Public humiliation sometimes accompanied them. Repeat offenders could face harsher consequences. Colonial officials wanted residents to understand that moderation mattered. The concern was not the drink. The concern was behavior. Taverns occupied an interesting position within this world. They served as gathering places. Travelers rested there. Business deals occurred there. News spread there. Yet authorities watched them carefully. Too much disorder could attract unwanted attention. Tavern keepers sometimes found themselves held responsible for the conduct of customers. Records show investigations into establishments accused of encouraging excessive drinking. The balance between commerce and morality remained delicate. Meanwhile, another category of offenses involved economic dishonesty. Colonial settlements depended upon trust. A merchant using false weights could cheat customers. A trader selling poor quality goods as premium products could undermine confidence in local markets. Such behavior threatened more than individual victims. It threatened the functioning of the community itself. For that reason, authorities often responded strongly. Punishments sought not only to compensate victims, but also to reassure the public. Visible consequences demonstrated that dishonest practices would not be tolerated. One famous example involved merchants required to acknowledge fraudulent behavior before neighbors. The embarrassment alone could prove costly. Customers remembered. Competitors remembered. Trust, once lost, proved difficult to recover. As the years passed, New England towns continued developing systems of social control that blended law, religion, and public opinion. Yet perhaps no group experienced the consequences more dramatically than those accused of challenging religious authority itself. The Puritans had crossed an ocean, partly because of religious disputes. Ironically, once established in America, they often showed little tolerance toward dissent within their own communities. Individuals expressing theological views considered dangerous could face investigation. Church leaders questioned them. Magistrates examined their statements. Neighbors provided testimony. The process could become intense. One of the most famous examples involved a woman whose religious ideas attracted widespread controversy. Her name was Anne Hutchinson. She arrived in Massachusetts during the 1630s and quickly gained followers through meetings held in her home. Many colonists admired her intelligence and knowledge of Scripture. Others grew concerned. Authorities feared her teachings challenged established religious leadership. The conflict escalated. Eventually, she was brought before colonial officials and questioned extensively. The proceedings lasted for days. The outcome became one of the most significant religious controversies in early New England history. Her story illustrates an important reality about Puritan America. Punishment was not limited to criminals in the modern sense. Sometimes it targeted ideas. Sometimes it targeted beliefs. Sometimes it targeted individuals who challenged authority. The leaders of Massachusetts believed they were protecting their community. Critics argued they were suppressing disagreement. The debate continues among historians even today. What remains clear is that dissent carried risks. The consequences could include banishment, public condemnation, or social isolation, and banishment itself would become one of the strangest punishments of all. Imagine being told to leave everything familiar behind. Your home, your land, your neighbors, your church, your entire community. Not because of violence, not because of theft, but because authorities no longer wanted you among them. For many colonists, exile represented a fate nearly as frightening as imprisonment. The wilderness beyond settled areas remained vast and uncertain. Survival was never guaranteed, yet banishment became an important tool used by Puritan governments to remove individuals considered disruptive or dangerous to the social order. Some of the most fascinating and dramatic stories of colonial America begin with such expulsions. And as our journey continues, we will soon meet the men and women whose lives were transformed forever by the decision of a Puritan court. The meeting houses still stand at the center of town. The bells still call worshippers together. The fields still stretch toward dark forests at the edge of settlement. But beneath the quiet rhythm of daily life, tensions are growing. New ideas are emerging. Old authorities feel challenged. And the strange punishments of Puritan America are about to become even more extraordinary. The threat of banishment hung over Puritan society like a distant storm cloud. Most residents never experienced it. Many hoped never to even think about it. Yet everyone understood its significance. a fine could be paid. Time in the stocks eventually ended. Public embarrassment slowly faded. Banishment was different. Once imposed, it could alter the entire course of a person's life. To appreciate why exile carried such weight, it helps to remember how isolated many settlements remained during the 17th century. Travel was slow. Roads were often little more than rough paths cutting through forests. Communication between towns could take days. The wilderness surrounding colonial settlements appeared immense. For many people, being forced to leave meant entering a world filled with uncertainty. One of the most famous victims of banishment was Roger Williams. His story began long before the punishment itself. Williams arrived in New England during the early 1630s. He was intelligent, deeply religious, and remarkably independent in his thinking. At first glance, he seemed like the sort of person who might thrive in Puritan Massachusetts. Yet problems emerged almost immediately. Williams believed certain practices within the colony were wrong. More importantly, he was willing to say so. He argued that church and government should remain separate. He questioned the colony's authority over religious matters. He criticized aspects of colonial land claims involving native peoples. To Puritan leaders, these ideas seemed dangerous. Their society depended upon a close relationship between religious and civil authority. Questioning that relationship threatened the foundation upon which the colony rested. Meetings were held, discussions took place, warnings were issued, yet Williams refused to abandon his convictions. Eventually, authorities reached a decision. In 1635, he was sentenced to banishment. The order required him to leave Massachusetts. Officials feared that allowing him to remain would encourage others to challenge established authority. At first, Williams delayed departure due to illness. The government soon learned that supporters continued visiting him. Concerned that his influence might spread, authorities prepared to arrest him and send him back to England. Before they could act, Williams escaped. It was winter. Snow covered much of the landscape. The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction. For weeks, he traveled through difficult conditions. Later, he described surviving with assistance from native communities. Eventually, he reached an area beyond Massachusetts' authority. There he established a settlement that would grow into Rhode Island. Ironically, the punishment intended to silence him helped create one of the colony's most associated with religious freedom. History often unfolds in unexpected ways. The leaders who expelled Williams believed they were protecting social order. Instead, they contributed to the emergence of a place where greater religious diversity became possible. His story reveals something important about Puritan punishments. The consequences sometimes extended far beyond the courtroom. A single decision could influence generations. Another dramatic example appeared only a few years later. This time the central figure was Anne Hutchinson. Her conflict with Massachusetts authorities had already become one of the colony's most controversial disputes. Following lengthy examinations and heated debates, leaders concluded that her teachings threatened community stability. The outcome was severe. She too faced banishment. Like Williams, Hutchinson left Massachusetts and eventually settled elsewhere. Yet the controversy surrounding her did not disappear. People continued discussing her ideas long after her departure. Supporters viewed her as courageous. Opponents regarded her as disruptive. Modern historians continue examining her story from multiple perspectives. What remains undeniable is that banishment served as one of the colony's most powerful tools for dealing with dissent. Rather than simply punishing individuals, authorities removed them entirely from the community. The practice reflected a broader belief. Puritan leaders often viewed society as a collective body. If one part became diseased, the entire body might suffer. Removing perceived sources of disorder, therefore, seemed necessary. Today, such thinking can appear harsh. In the 17th century, many considered it practical. The same logic influenced responses to another group that would soon encounter fierce opposition. These newcomers arrived with beliefs unlike those of the Puritans. They rejected many established religious customs. They emphasized direct spiritual experience. They spoke openly and passionately, and they refused to remain silent when challenged. They were known as Quakers. The arrival of Quakers created immediate tension. Puritan authorities regarded their teachings as deeply troubling. Officials worried that Quaker ideas could undermine church discipline and social hierarchy. The response was swift. Laws were passed. Restrictions were imposed. Punishments increased. Quakers entering Massachusetts sometimes faced fines. Others experienced imprisonment. Books associated with their beliefs could be confiscated. Meetings became targets of official scrutiny. The conflict escalated rapidly. Some Quakers persisted despite repeated warnings. They returned even after being expelled. They continued preaching despite penalties. Their determination astonished both supporters and opponents. One particularly striking punishment involved public whipping. Colonial authorities believed severe penalties would discourage future violations. Instead, some Quakers interpreted suffering as evidence of faithfulness. The result was a cycle of punishment and resistance. Each side became more determined. The situation eventually produced some of the most controversial events in early American history. Several Quakers repeatedly returned to Massachusetts despite banishment orders. Authorities viewed these returns as direct challenges to legal authority. Punishments became increasingly severe. In a few cases, executions followed. These events shocked observers both within the colonies and abroad. Even some individuals who supported Puritan governance, questioned whether matters had gone too far. The controversy damaged Massachusetts' reputation. Criticism spread. Pressure increased. Over time, attitudes gradually shifted. Yet the episode illustrates how seriously colonial leaders viewed threats to religious conformity. To them, maintaining unity justified extraordinary measures. Meanwhile, everyday residents encountered strange punishments for less dramatic offenses. Not every case involved famous figures. Most involved ordinary people: farmers, laborers, servants, tradesmen, widows, teenagers, individuals whose names survive only because court clerks recorded them centuries ago. One recurring offense involved failing to control livestock. Modern readers may smile at the idea, yet wandering animals created genuine problems. A loose pig could damage crops. Unsupervised cattle might destroy fences. Stray livestock could spark disputes between neighbors. Colonial courts handled countless complaints concerning animals. Owners found responsible for repeated problems sometimes faced fines or public reprimands. The records reveal how closely daily life depended upon cooperation. Even minor disruptions could generate conflict. Another frequent issue involved fences. In agricultural communities, fences mattered enormously. They protected crops. They marked boundaries. They reduced disputes. Poorly maintained fences often led to arguments when animals crossed property lines and caused damage. Determining responsibility became important. Court documents contain surprisingly detailed discussions of fence construction, repairs, and inspections. Such matters may seem mundane today. To colonial residents, they could affect survival. A damaged harvest might mean hunger during winter. Consequently, authorities devoted considerable attention to issues that modern legal systems might consider minor. As settlements expanded, local governments developed increasingly complex regulations governing daily life. Some laws addressed fire safety. Others focused upon sanitation. Many reflected practical concerns rather than purely religious ones. Wooden buildings stood close together. A single accidental fire could destroy large portions of a town. Residents therefore faced strict expectations regarding chimneys, hearths, and fire prevention. Neglecting these responsibilities sometimes resulted in penalties. Again, the goal was prevention. Authorities preferred avoiding disaster rather than responding afterward. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of Puritan punishment was not the penalties themselves. It was the worldview behind them. The leaders of New England genuinely believed they were creating a model society. They viewed themselves as participants in a grand experiment. Their laws reflected that ambition. Their punishments reflected that ambition. Every fine, public confession, whipping, or banishment served a larger purpose. They were attempting to shape behavior, to preserve order, to protect what they considered a sacred community. Whether they succeeded remains a matter of debate. What cannot be denied is that they created a society unlike any other in early America. And as the decades move forward, new fears will emerge, new conflicts will appear. The strange punishments of Puritan America will take even darker forms, for soon the colonies will enter a period marked by suspicion, accusations, and panic, a time when invisible crimes become the focus of public attention, a time when fear itself becomes evidence, a time that future generations will remember as one of the most unsettling chapters in American history. And that chapter is waiting just ahead. The closing years of the 17th century brought new challenges to New England. The settlements had survived difficult winters. They had expanded beyond their earliest boundaries. Children born in the colonies were becoming adults. Entire generations now knew no other home. Yet beneath the appearance of stability, anxieties continued to grow. Wars along the frontier created uncertainty. Disease outbreaks remained frighteningly common. Crop failures still threatened livelihoods. Political changes in England created additional tension. Many colonists believed they were living in dangerous times. When communities feel anxious, people often search for explanations. Sometimes those explanations are practical. Sometimes they are not. In Puritan New England, misfortune frequently carried spiritual meaning. A failed harvest might suggest divine displeasure. An unexpected illness could provoke questions about hidden sins. A sudden tragedy might inspire fears that unseen forces were at work. These beliefs formed the background for one of the most famous episodes in American history. It began in a small village known as Salem. Today, the name immediately brings one subject to mind. But the people living there in the early 1690s did not know they were about to become part of history. For them, life remained ordinary. Families worked fields. Children performed chores. Merchants conducted business. Church services continued each week. Yet beneath the routine, disputes simmered. Arguments over property, disagreements within families, conflicts involving church leadership, economic pressures, political uncertainty. Many tensions already existed before the crisis began. Then strange reports started to spread. Several young girls began exhibiting unusual behavior. Witnesses described fits, screams, sudden movements, and unexplained complaints. Doctors struggled to identify a physical cause. Soon, a frightening possibility emerged. Some residents suggested witchcraft. To modern audiences, the accusation may seem extraordinary. In the 17th century, belief in witchcraft was widespread across Europe and its colonies. Educated people believed it. Religious leaders believed it. Government officials believed it. The existence of witches was considered a fact rather than a fantasy. The real question was not whether witches existed. The question was whether witches were responsible for a particular event. As suspicions spread through Salem, accusations multiplied, names began to circulate, individuals found themselves questioned, neighbors shared stories, rumors expanded, fear traveled faster than evidence. Soon local authorities became involved. Investigations began. Interrogations followed. What started as a handful of accusations transformed into something much larger. The punishments associated with witchcraft accusations differed from many earlier Puritan penalties. This was no longer merely about public embarrassment or community discipline. Lives were now at stake. The legal process itself reflected the fears of the era. Judges listened to testimony that modern courts would reject immediately. Witnesses described dreams. They described visions. They claimed to see invisible spirits. Some testified that accused individuals appeared to them in supernatural forms. Such evidence became known as spectral evidence. Today it seems deeply unreliable. At the time, many authorities considered it meaningful. As accusations increased, pressure mounted. People feared being associated with suspects. Friendships became dangerous. Even defending an accused person could attract suspicion. The social trust that held communities together began to weaken. This atmosphere created opportunities for old grievances to resurface. A disagreement over property might suddenly acquire a new interpretation. A long-standing family dispute could take on sinister implications. Ordinary tensions became entangled with extraordinary fears. One accusation led to another, then another. The cycle continued. Those accused faced a grim situation. Confessing sometimes improved the chances of survival. Maintaining innocence could prove dangerous. The logic appears strange to modern observers, yet many believed witches concealed their crimes through deception. A denial, therefore, did not necessarily help. In some cases, it increased suspicion. The result was a legal environment unlike anything most people experience today. Fear shaped decisions. Fear shaped testimony. Fear shaped outcomes. As the months passed, arrests multiplied, prisons filled, families faced uncertainty. Communities struggled to understand what was happening. Some individuals accused of witchcraft had respectable reputations. Others had lived peacefully among neighbors for years. The accusations crossed social boundaries. Age offered little protection. Neither did status. No one could be entirely certain who might be accused next. One of the most tragic aspects of the crisis involved the punishment imposed before any verdict was reached. Imprisonment itself could be devastating. Colonial jails were uncomfortable places. Conditions were often harsh. Food might be limited. Disease posed constant risks. Families sometimes paid fees associated with confinement. the financial burden could become significant. Thus, even those ultimately cleared of accusations often suffered serious consequences. The punishment began long before a final judgment. Then came the trials, courtrooms filled with spectators. Testimony unfolded. Accusers pointed toward defendants. Judges attempted to navigate an increasingly chaotic situation. Each proceeding generated new fears and new rumors. The process fed upon itself as more accusations appeared. Belief in a widespread conspiracy seemed increasingly plausible to many observers. The colony appeared trapped within a growing web of suspicion. Yet not everyone accepted the proceedings without question. Gradually, doubts emerged. Some respected leaders expressed concerns about the evidence being used. Others worried innocent people were suffering. A few influential voices urged caution. At first, those concerns struggled to gain traction. Fear remained powerful, but over time, skepticism increased. The turning point came slowly, as accusations expanded to include more prominent individuals. Confidence in the process began to erode. People who previously trusted the investigations started asking difficult questions. Could so many accusations truly be accurate? Was the evidence reliable? Had fear overwhelmed reason? These questions became increasingly difficult to ignore. Before the crisis ended, numerous people would lose their lives. Many others would see their reputations destroyed. Families would be divided. Communities would remain haunted by memories of the events for generations. What makes this chapter particularly relevant to a discussion of Puritan punishments is the way ordinary legal safeguards collapsed under pressure. The system that had been designed to preserve order instead produced chaos. The punishments became more severe precisely when certainty became weaker. It was a dangerous combination. History offers many examples of societies responding poorly to fear. Salem became one of the most famous. Yet, while witchcraft trials capture public imagination, they also risk overshadowing an important reality. Most Puritan punishments involved neither witches nor executions. Most involved ordinary people navigating everyday expectations. The majority of court cases concerned practical matters: debt, property, behavior, work, family responsibilities, local disputes. These records reveal a society attempting to regulate nearly every aspect of daily life. Sometimes the results seem reasonable. Sometimes they seem strange. Sometimes they seem deeply unfair. Together, they create a portrait of a world very different from our own. A world where communities valued conformity over individual expression. A world where public shame served as a primary tool of social control. A world where religious beliefs influenced legal outcomes in profound ways. And a world where fear could occasionally transform ordinary suspicions into extraordinary tragedies. The Salem crisis would eventually come to an end. The panic would subside. Questions would remain. Regrets would follow. Some participants later admitted mistakes. Others spent years reflecting upon what had happened. The colonies themselves would gradually change. New ideas were beginning to emerge. Attitudes toward authority were evolving. The strict certainty that characterized early Puritan society would not remain unchanged forever. Yet before those transformations arrived, countless residents still lived under systems of discipline that shaped every stage of life, from childhood to old age, from church attendance to business transactions, from family relationships to personal conduct. Rules governed almost everything. And in the next chapter of our journey, we will step away from the famous trials and return to the everyday lives of ordinary colonists, where some of the most peculiar and revealing punishments of all were quietly unfolding in town squares, meeting houses, classrooms, and homes across Puritan America. When people think about Puritan punishments today, dramatic events often come to mind first. The witch trials, public whippings, banishments, stories of religious conflict. Yet for most residents of New England, life was shaped less by spectacular punishments and more by a constant network of everyday rules. These regulations reached into nearly every corner of existence. How people dressed, how they worshipped, how they treated neighbors, how they raised children, how they spent their evenings, even how they spoke during ordinary conversations. To modern eyes, some of these expectations seem surprisingly detailed. Yet to Puritan authorities, such regulations served an important purpose. A godly society, they believed, could not simply appear on its own. It had to be maintained every day, every week, every year, and maintaining it required vigilance. One area where this vigilance appeared most clearly was attendance at church. Church was not merely a religious institution. It functioned as the center of community life. Important announcements were made there. Political matters were discussed there. Social relationships developed there. Moral instruction occurred there. Missing services therefore attracted attention. When someone failed to attend without an acceptable reason, questions often followed. Perhaps illness explained the absence. Perhaps bad weather prevented travel. But if no satisfactory explanation emerged, local authorities could become involved. Fines represented one common response. Repeated absences might lead to greater scrutiny. The expectation was simple. Everyone should participate. Everyone should be present. Everyone should hear the same teachings. This emphasis on uniformity reflected a broader concern. Puritan leaders feared fragmentation. They worried that individual choices could weaken collective discipline. As a result, attendance became more than a personal matter. It became a civic responsibility. The services themselves could last for hours. Modern audiences, accustomed to shorter gatherings might find this surprising. Sermons often extended well beyond what many people expect today. Congregants sat on hard wooden benches. Buildings were cold during winter. Children struggled to remain still. Adults fought fatigue, yet attention was expected. Distractions were discouraged, and those who disrupted services sometimes found themselves facing consequences. Records survive describing individuals reprimanded for sleeping during sermons. The image may seem amusing. After all, long sermons and uncomfortable seating can challenge anyone's concentration, yet authorities viewed such behavior seriously. Religious instruction occupied a central place in community life. Failing to pay attention appeared disrespectful. In some cases, church officials employed creative methods to keep people awake. Historical accounts describe attendants carrying long poles. One end might gently tap sleeping men. The other end, sometimes equipped with softer materials, could awaken women who drifted off during lengthy sermons. The practice sounds unusual today, but it reflects how seriously worship services were regarded. Maintaining attention was considered important enough to warrant intervention. Children experienced similar expectations. Puritan childhood involved responsibilities from an early age. Young people contributed to household labor. They learned religious lessons. They participated in family duties. Obedience occupied a central place in their education. Parents possessed extensive authority over their children. This authority was supported by both religious teachings and legal structures. Disobedience could bring consequences at home. In more serious cases, authorities might become involved. The goal, at least in theory, was not cruelty. The goal was discipline. Puritan society believed character developed through correction. Allowing bad habits to grow unchecked seemed dangerous. Teachers shared many of these assumptions. Schools emphasized reading, especially reading religious texts. Education held considerable importance because individuals were expected to engage with Scripture directly. Learning to read, therefore, carried spiritual significance. Yet classrooms of the 17th century differed greatly from modern schools. Discipline often relied upon strict methods. Students who misbehaved could face embarrassment before classmates. Mistakes might result in punishment. Order remained a priority. Teachers were expected to maintain control. The educational environment reflected the broader values of the society around it. Work represented another area where authorities paid close attention. Idleness generated suspicion. Puritans generally viewed productive labor as both practical and moral. Work supported families. Work strengthened communities. Work reflected personal responsibility. Consequently, individuals perceived as lazy sometimes attracted criticism. Court records occasionally mention people accused of neglecting duties or failing to contribute appropriately. Such accusations could damage reputations. A hardworking individual earned respect. A person viewed as idle often faced social pressure. This emphasis on labor influenced attitudes toward poverty as well. Many communities provided assistance to those genuinely unable to support themselves. Widows, orphans, individuals suffering illness or disability. Yet officials often distinguished between those considered deserving of aid and those perceived as unwilling to work. The distinction could significantly affect how people were treated. Again, the central concern involved responsibility. Puritan society placed enormous value upon fulfilling one's obligations. Family life reflected these expectations too. Marriage was highly valued. Stable households were considered essential to social order. Disputes within families occasionally reached local courts. Cases involving inheritance, property, and domestic disagreements appear frequently in surviving records. While modern readers may imagine colonial courts dealing primarily with dramatic crimes, much of their time was spent resolving ordinary conflicts. Who owned a particular piece of land? Who owed money to whom? Who had failed to fulfill an agreement? Such questions occupied officials constantly. Many punishments therefore involved restitution rather than spectacle. A person who caused financial harm might be ordered to compensate the injured party. Someone who violated a contract could face legal consequences. These cases reveal a side of Puritan justice, often overshadowed by more famous stories. Not every punishment involved public humiliation. Many focused on restoring order and resolving disputes. Nevertheless, public reputation remained enormously important. This became especially clear in cases involving slander. People cared deeply about what others said about them. False accusations could affect business opportunities. They could influence marriages. They could damage standing within the church. Consequently, courts frequently handled complaints involving harmful speech. Witnesses testified. Evidence was examined. Judgments were rendered. The resulting punishments varied, but the underlying concern remained consistent. Social trust mattered. Words possessed power. Protecting reputations, therefore, seemed necessary. One particularly interesting category of cases involved disputes between neighbors. Colonial settlements required cooperation. People borrowed tools, shared resources, helped one another during harvests, assisted with construction projects. Yet close proximity also created opportunities for conflict. Arguments over fences remained common. So did disagreements concerning livestock. A wandering cow could destroy crops. A pig might damage gardens. A neglected boundary marker could spark years of disagreement. Local courts often found themselves mediating such disputes. The records reveal a world where everyday relationships carried enormous importance. Maintaining harmony required constant effort. Sometimes authorities attempted to encourage that harmony through punishment. A person repeatedly causing trouble could become the subject of official attention, not necessarily because the offense itself was severe, rather because repeated disruptions threatened community stability. This pattern appears throughout Puritan legal history. Minor problems often became major concerns when they occurred repeatedly. The focus rested less upon isolated mistakes and more upon persistent behavior. Another revealing aspect of Puritan life involved entertainment. Modern societies offer countless forms of recreation. Movies, sports, video games, concerts, social media. Colonial residents possessed far fewer options, yet leisure activities still existed. People gathered for conversation. Families visited one another. Community events occurred. Certain games were played. At the same time, authorities remained cautious. They worried excessive amusement could distract individuals from religious obligations. Some activities attracted criticism. Others faced restrictions. The precise rules varied between communities and across time. What remained consistent was the belief that recreation should not undermine moral discipline. The balance between enjoyment and responsibility received considerable attention. As the years passed, these countless regulations helped shape daily life throughout Puritan New England. Most residents adapted to them. Many accepted them as normal. After all, they had grown up within this system. The rules formed part of the world they knew. Yet change was slowly approaching. New generations possessed different experiences. Trade connected the colonies to broader networks. Ideas traveled across oceans. Economic opportunities expanded. The strict social order established by the earliest Puritan settlers would gradually encounter new pressures. And as those pressures increased, the strange punishments that once seemed essential to maintaining order would begin facing questions they had rarely confronted before. Questions about authority, questions about individual freedom, questions about the limits of public control. Those questions would not transform society overnight, but they would begin a process that eventually reshaped the colonies themselves. And that transformation is where our story will continue. As the 18th century slowly approached, the world of Puritan New England began to change in subtle ways. The transformation was not dramatic at first. No single day marked the end of the old order. No bell rang to announce that a new era had arrived. Instead, change crept into daily life gradually, almost quietly, like the tide rising along a shoreline. The children and grandchildren of the first settlers were growing up in circumstances very different from those experienced by their ancestors. The original Puritan founders had crossed an ocean, seeking to build what they believed would be a model Christian society. Many had endured hardship, uncertainty, and sacrifice. Their descendants inherited the communities they created, yet they did not always inherit the same sense of urgency. The wilderness no longer seemed quite as threatening. Towns were larger. Trade was more established. Roads connected settlements that had once stood isolated from one another. A growing population meant people interacted with strangers more frequently than earlier generations had. As communities expanded, maintaining the same level of social control became increasingly difficult. In a village of 100 people, everyone knows everyone. In a town of several thousand, anonymity begins to emerge. People can move between neighborhoods. Visitors arrive from distant places. Merchants travel regularly. New ideas spread more easily. This gradual shift created challenges for authorities accustomed to close supervision. For decades, Puritan leaders had relied heavily upon public shame as a tool of discipline. The system worked largely because communities were small. Everyone knew who had been punished. Everyone remembered. Everyone talked. But as settlements grew, public embarrassment lost some of its power. A person might recover more easily from a damaged reputation. New opportunities existed elsewhere. A resident who felt unwelcome in one town could sometimes relocate to another. Mobility changed the equation. Punishments that once seemed highly effective began producing less predictable results. At the same time, economic life became more complex. The earliest settlements had focused heavily upon agriculture. Most families farmed. Many households produced much of what they consumed. Over time, however, commerce expanded. Craftsmen specialized in particular trades. Shipbuilding developed. Fishing industries grew. Merchants established wider networks. Imported goods became more common. Economic growth brought prosperity to some residents. It also created new forms of inequality. Differences in wealth became more visible. This development posed an interesting problem for Puritan ideals. The founders had emphasized modesty and humility. They worried about pride. They discouraged excessive displays of luxury. Yet successful merchants increasingly possessed access to imported fabrics, decorative items, and consumer goods. Questions emerged. How much wealth was acceptable? How visibly should prosperity be displayed? The answers were not always clear. Authorities sometimes attempted to regulate clothing and appearance. Certain laws restricted who could wear particular fabrics or decorative accessories. The purpose was partly economic. More importantly, it was social. Leaders feared that visible luxury might encourage envy, pride, and social instability. Today, such regulations may seem unusual, yet they reflected a society deeply concerned with maintaining order. Clothing communicated status. Status influenced relationships. Managing appearances therefore became another way of managing society. Of course, Enforcing such regulations proved difficult. People often found creative ways around restrictions. Human nature rarely changes. Throughout history, individuals have displayed remarkable ingenuity when attempting to acquire desired goods. Colonial New England was no exception. Court records reveal occasional disputes involving clothing, fashion, and social expectations. The existence of these disputes reminds us that even highly regulated societies contain resistance. Not every resident agreed with every rule. Not every resident obeyed willingly. Another area undergoing change involved education. Literacy rates in New England remained unusually high compared with many parts of the world during the same period. The Puritans valued reading because they wanted individuals to engage directly with Scripture. This emphasis produced long-term consequences. A literate population gained greater access to ideas. Books circulated more widely. Pamphlets spread arguments and opinions. People encountered perspectives beyond those offered by local authorities. The ability to read did not automatically create independence. It did, however, create possibilities as educational opportunities expanded. Intellectual life became increasingly dynamic. Religious leaders noticed these developments. Some welcomed them, others expressed concern. Knowledge could strengthen faith, but it could also inspire questions. Questions sometimes led to disagreement. Disagreement occasionally led to conflict. Conflict often brought authorities face to face with an uncomfortable reality. Controlling behavior is easier than controlling ideas. Ideas move from person to person. They travel through conversations. They cross borders. They survive punishments. Roger Williams had demonstrated this decades earlier. Anne Hutchinson had demonstrated it as well. Removing individuals did not necessarily remove their influence. The colonies continued learning that lesson. Meanwhile, ordinary punishments remained part of daily life. Whippings still occurred. Fines remained common. Public confessions continued. Stocks and pillories had not disappeared, yet attitudes toward these penalties slowly evolved. Some people began questioning whether public humiliation achieved its intended goals. Others worried about inconsistency. Why should similar offenses receive different punishments in different towns? Why should local customs vary so widely? These concerns did not immediately transform legal systems. Nevertheless, they signaled a broader shift. People were beginning to think differently about authority. One particularly revealing trend involved the growing use of monetary penalties. Fines offered practical advantages. They generated revenue. They avoided some of the spectacle associated with public punishments. They could be adjusted according to circumstances. As colonial economies expanded, financial penalties became increasingly attractive. The shift was gradual rather than sudden. Public punishments continued for many years. Yet the balance slowly changed. The law began moving, little by little, toward different methods of enforcement. The transformation was especially noticeable in larger towns. Urban environments created challenges unfamiliar to earlier generations. Growing populations produced more disputes. Commercial activity increased legal complexity. Officials required systems capable of handling larger volumes of cases. Traditional methods remained important, but new approaches emerged alongside them. At the same time, influences from England continued shaping colonial attitudes. Political debates occurring across the Atlantic affected life in America. Ideas about rights, governance, and justice traveled with remarkable speed. Considering the limitations of 17th and 18th century communication, books crossed oceans, letters circulated, visitors carried news, colonists paid attention. Gradually, discussions about government authority became more sophisticated. The same communities that once accepted extensive social regulation, without question, began engaging in more nuanced debates. What powers should government possess? What limits should exist? How should laws be applied? These questions would become increasingly important as the century progressed. Yet despite these changes, many aspects of Puritan culture remained deeply rooted. Church attendance still mattered. Family authority remained strong. Moral expectations continued influencing public life. The old order had not vanished. Rather, it was adapting. Some traditions endured, others weakened. New ideas mixed with old assumptions. The result was a society in transition. For historians, these transitional periods are often the most fascinating. People living through them rarely realize how much is changing around them. Daily routines continue. Work continues. Families continue. Life feels normal. Only later do patterns become visible. Looking back, we can see that New England was moving gradually away from the rigid social world of its earliest Puritan founders. The movement was uneven. Some communities changed rapidly. Others resisted. Different regions followed different paths. But the overall direction becomes increasingly clear. The strange punishments that once stood at the center of public life were slowly losing their dominance. New approaches were emerging. New attitudes were developing. And new generations were beginning to imagine society differently than their grandparents had. Yet before those transformations fully unfolded, one final challenge awaited the Puritan system. A challenge not created by a single person, a single crime, or a single controversy. Instead, it would emerge from the cumulative weight of decades, the weight of changing economies, changing populations, changing ideas, and changing expectations. The world that had produced stocks, pillories, public confessions, and banishments was beginning to fade, but its legacy would remain. And in the next part of our journey, we will explore how that legacy continued shaping American attitudes toward crime, punishment, morality, and public behavior long after the original Puritan communities had changed beyond recognition. By the early 1700s, Puritan New England was no longer the same world that had existed a generation earlier. The strict vision of the earliest settlers still lingered in sermons, laws, and cultural memory. But the daily reality of life had shifted in ways that could not be reversed. The colonies had grown too large. The economy had grown too complex. The population had grown too diverse. And perhaps most importantly, the ideas circulating through society had grown too difficult to contain. The old methods of punishment still existed, but they no longer carried the same unquestioned authority. Public shamming, once the backbone of discipline, began to lose some of its effectiveness. A person standing in the stocks no longer guaranteed universal social ruin. A confession read in church no longer defined a person's entire future. A banishment order no longer meant complete disappearance into the unknown. The world had become too interconnected for absolute isolation. Even so, the legacy of Puritan punishment remained deeply embedded in colonial culture. It shaped how people thought about wrongdoing. It shaped how communities responded to conflict. And it shaped how authority justified its actions. The idea that behavior should be visible, regulated, and corrected in public did not disappear. It evolved. One of the most important changes during this period was the gradual shift from community-driven punishment to more formal legal systems. In earlier decades, local towns had significant influence over enforcement. Church leaders and magistrates worked closely together. Social pressure and religious expectation reinforced legal authority. But as time passed, colonial governments became more structured. Courts became more standardized. Legal procedures became more formal. This shift reduced the reliance on informal community enforcement. It also reduced the frequency of some of the more theatrical punishments that had defined earlier generations. Public humiliation did not vanish overnight, but it began to fade from everyday use. In its place came systems that emphasized documentation, procedure, and financial penalties. Records became more important than spectacle. Written judgments became more important than public displays. This transformation reflected broader changes in colonial society. As towns expanded into cities, personal familiarity weakened. People could no longer rely on everyone knowing everyone else's reputation. Legal systems had to function without assuming shared social knowledge. That required new methods. It also required new thinking. At the same time, religious influence over law slowly began to decline. This does not mean religion lost importance. Churches remained central to community life. Religious beliefs continued shaping moral expectations, but the direct overlap between church discipline and civil punishment became less absolute. Different institutions began to separate more clearly. This separation did not happen uniformly across all colonies, but the trend was visible. It marked an important step in the long evolution of American governance. Another significant development involved changing attitudes toward crime itself. Earlier Puritan systems often viewed wrongdoing primarily as moral failure. Sin and crime were closely linked. Punishment was intended not only to correct behavior, but also to restore moral order. By the 18th century, however, legal thinking gradually began to incorporate more practical considerations. Crime was still wrong, but it was also increasingly seen in terms of social impact, prevention, and administration. This shift did not eliminate moral language, but it broadened the framework. Punishment became less about public humiliation and more about regulation and control. Fines, imprisonment, and structured legal procedures became more common. Physical punishments and public spectacles became less frequent. Yet even as these changes unfolded, older practices did not disappear entirely. In some rural areas, traditional punishments lingered longer. Stocks and public reprimands could still be found in certain communities. Human habits change slowly, especially in places where tradition holds a strong influence. What is particularly striking is how long the cultural memory of these punishments persisted. Even after many practices had declined, they remained part of storytelling, cautionary tales, and historical identity. They became symbols of a past defined by strict discipline and moral certainty. Over time, that past itself became a subject of fascination. Later generations would look back at Puritan America with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. How could a society rely so heavily on public shame? Why were such punishments considered necessary? What did they reveal about fear, belief, and community life? These questions continue to interest historians today. One of the key insights that emerges from studying this period is that Puritan punishments cannot be understood in isolation. They were not random acts of cruelty or unusual quirks of history. They were part of a coherent worldview, a worldview in which community survival, religious devotion, and social order were deeply intertwined. From that perspective, punishment was not merely corrective. It was protective. It was meant to preserve the integrity of the community, whether or not one agrees with that logic. Understanding it is essential to understanding the society that produced it. Another important insight involves the relationship between fear and governance. Throughout Puritan history, fear played a powerful role. Fear of disorder, fear of moral decline, fear of divine judgment, fear of social breakdown. These fears shaped laws, influenced punishments, and justified strict enforcement. Yet fear is not a stable foundation. Over time, it shifts. as conditions change, the intensity of fear can diminish or transform into different concerns. By the 18th century, new anxieties were emerging. Concerns about trade, concerns about political authority, concerns about representation and rights. The focus was gradually moving away from strict moral enforcement toward broader questions of governance. Still, the legacy of Puritan discipline did not vanish. It left behind cultural patterns that would continue influencing American attitudes long after the original colonies had transformed. Ideas about personal responsibility remained strong. Expectations of moral behavior persisted. The belief that communities could and should regulate conduct did not disappear entirely. It simply took new forms. Even today, traces of that legacy can be found in discussions about law, order, and social responsibility. Looking back, the strange punishments of Puritan America appear both distant and familiar. Distant in their methods, familiar in their motivations. They reveal a society deeply concerned with maintaining order in a fragile environment. They reveal the challenges of building communities under uncertainty, and they reveal how belief systems shape not only laws, but the everyday lives of ordinary people. As we reach the later chapters of this journey, we begin to see Puritan America not as a collection of odd punishments, but as a living society struggling to define itself. A society balancing faith and survival, authority and change, tradition and adaptation. The punishments that once seemed so strange were, in their own time, part of a system that many believed was necessary. Understanding that system does not require agreement, but it does require perspective. And with that perspective, the story of Puritan punishment becomes something larger, a reflection of how human societies respond to fear, how they enforce order, and how they eventually change. This brings us to the final stage of our journey, where we look back at everything we have explored, from public humiliation in village squares to the fatting of an entire system of discipline, and consider what it all reveals about the long evolution of justice in early America. By the time the old Puritan system had fully begun to fade, New England no longer looked like the fragile frontier society of the early 1600s. What had once been scattered settlements along a harsh coastline had become a network of towns connected by trade, law, and shared history. The wilderness still existed, but it no longer defined daily life in the same way. And with that shift, the logic behind many earlier punishments began to weaken. In the early years, public shame had been one of the strongest forces holding communities together. Everyone knew everyone. Everyone depended on everyone. A damaged reputation could mean social and economic isolation. But as time passed, that social structure loosened. People moved more frequently. Commerce expanded beyond local boundaries. New arrivals entered towns without long shared histories. The tight web of observation that had once made public punishment so powerful began to unravel. A person standing in the stocks no longer guaranteed permanent disgrace. In some cases, it simply became a temporary inconvenience, a spectacle rather than a lasting warning. This change forced authorities to reconsider how discipline should work. The question was no longer only how to punish behavior, but how to ensure punishment remained meaningful in a changing society. The answer increasingly leaned toward systems that did not rely on public spectacle. Imprisonment became more common. Fines became more structured. Written legal records replaced oral community memory. Justice began moving from the town square into the courtroom. This shift marked a fundamental transformation. Punishment was becoming institutional rather than communal, but the transition was not smooth or immediate. Old practices lingered in some places. New methods emerged unevenly. Different regions adapted at different speeds. Some communities held onto traditional punishments longer than others, especially where older social structures remained intact. In rural areas, public discipline still carried weight for some time. In more urbanized centers, however, change came faster. There, anonymity reduced the effectiveness of shame-based punishment. A person might move through a crowd of strangers without any shared social context. That anonymity made reputation less fragile and punishment less socially binding. At the same time, broader intellectual shifts were reshaping how people thought about law itself. The Enlightenment, spreading across the Atlantic world, introduced new ideas about reason, governance, and individual rights. Thinkers began to question older assumptions about punishment. Was the purpose to shame, to deter, to reform, or simply to maintain order? These questions did not produce immediate answers, but they changed the direction of legal thought. Punishment began to be discussed less in moral terms alone, and more in terms of effectiveness and structure. What actually worked? What produced stability? What reduced repeated offenses? These practical concerns gradually gained importance. Even within religious communities, there was growing recognition that not all behaviors could be controlled through humiliation or fear. Some problems required different approaches. Some behaviors resisted public correction altogether. As these ideas developed, the more theatrical elements of Puritan punishment slowly receded into history. Stocks and pillories became less common. Public confessions became less central. Banishment remained, but was used more cautiously. The system did not disappear in a single moment. It dissolved gradually, replaced piece by more modern legal structures. Yet its influence remained visible. One of the most lasting legacies was the belief that society has a role in shaping behavior, even as public punishments declined. The idea that communities should respond to wrongdoing did not vanish. It simply changed form. Modern legal systems still reflect this principle. Laws still aim to regulate behavior. Courts still impose consequences. Society still debates morality and responsibility. What changed was not the existence of punishment, but its expression. The story of Puritan America's strange punishments is therefore not only about the past, it is also about origins of ideas that continue to shape discussions about justice today, origins of tensions between individual freedom and collective order, origins of debates about how far authority should reach into private life. Looking back, it becomes clear that Puritan punishment systems were deeply tied to the environment in which they developed. Small communities required strong cohesion. Survival depended on cooperation. Religious belief provided structure and meaning. Under those conditions, visible punishment made sense to those who used it. But as conditions changed, the system changed with them. What once felt necessary gradually became outdated. What once enforced order began to appear excessive. And what once defined justice slowly gave way to new interpretations of fairness. Yet even as those older systems faded, they left behind a cultural imprint. The idea that behavior should be guided, that communities have moral responsibilities, that actions carry consequences beyond the individual. These ideas did not disappear with the stocks or the pillory. They evolved into new forms of law, education, and social expectation. In that sense, the strange punishments of Puritan America are not simply historical curiosities. They are part of a longer story about how human societies organize themselves, how they define right and wrong, how they respond when those definitions are challenged, and how they eventually adapt when the world around them changes. As we come to the final reflections of this journey, it becomes clear that the real story is not only about punishment. It is about people trying to build order in an uncertain world. It is about the tension between fear and stability, between authority and change, between tradition and transformation. And it is about how those tensions shaped one of the earliest chapters in the development of American society. The wooden structures, the quiet villages, the stern sermons, and the public punishments all belonged to a world that has largely vanished. But the questions that world raised have not disappeared. They continue in different forms, even today. And that is where the story ultimately ends, not with the disappearance of punishment, but with its transformation into something new, something more complex, something still unfolding. By the time the Puritan world fully receded into history, it no longer existed as a living system of law, religion, and punishment. What remained was something quieter, a legacy embedded in institutions, habits, and assumptions that continued long after the original settlements had transformed into something new. The stocks were gone from most town squares. The pillory had faded into memory. Public confessions no longer defined community discipline, and banishment, once one of the most feared tools of control, had become rare and highly restricted. But the disappearance of these practices did not mean the disappearance of their influence. Instead, their influence shifted shape. One of the most enduring remnants was the belief that behavior is not purely private. In Puritan society, actions were never fully isolated from the community. A mistake could become public knowledge quickly. A rumor could spread across an entire town. A single incident could define a person's reputation for years. Even as legal systems evolved, this sensitivity to public behavior remained. In later American society, it would reappear in different contexts. Courts still mattered, but so did reputation. Law still governed punishment, but social judgment continued operating alongside it. The Puritan emphasis on visible morality did not vanish. It evolved into cultural expectations about conduct, respectability, and accountability. Another lasting legacy involved the relationship between authority and community. In early New England, authority was deeply local. Church leaders, magistrates, and neighbors all participated in enforcement. Justice was not distant. It was immediate and visible. Over time, as institutions became more centralized and formal, this direct involvement decreased. But the underlying idea that society has a stake in individual behavior remained intact. Modern systems of law still reflect this principle, even if the methods have changed. Punishment is no longer public humiliation in the town square, but it is still a social mechanism intended to enforce boundaries. Perhaps the most important transformation, however, was conceptual. The Puritan system was built on a moral framework where law, religion, and community were inseparable. Sin and crime were closely linked. Disobedience was not only a legal issue, but a spiritual one. Over time, these categories began to separate. Law became more secular in structure. Religion remained influential, but no longer defined legal authority in the same direct way. This separation did not eliminate moral thinking from law, but it broadened it. It allowed for multiple interpretations of behavior rather than a single unified doctrine. This shift fundamentally changed the nature of punishment. It moved away from correction through shame toward correction through regulation, incarceration, and legal procedure. Yet even this transformation did not erase older instincts. Human societies continue to struggle with the same core questions that shaped Puritan New England. How should communities respond to harm? What role should shame play in accountability? How much authority should institutions have over personal behavior? When does correction become excessive? And what does justice actually require? These questions remain open, even centuries later. Seen in this light, the strange punishments of Puritan America are not simply relics of a distant and unfamiliar past. They are early expressions of debates that continue today in different forms. Debates about surveillance, public accountability, social judgment, and legal authority. The tools have changed. The language has changed. But the underlying tensions remain remarkably consistent. Another important legacy is the way Puritan society illustrates the connection between fear and structure. In a fragile environment, fear of disorder helped shape strict systems of control. Punishments were designed not only to correct individuals, but to reassure the community that order still existed. That sense of reassurance was critical in a world where survival was uncertain. As conditions improved over time, that level of fear gradually diminished. And as fear diminished, so too did the need for extreme forms of public punishment. Stability made restraint possible. Security made moderation more practical. This pattern appears repeatedly in history. When societies feel threatened, control tightens. When societies feel secure, control relaxes. The Puritan experience offers one clear example of this dynamic in action. By the end of the colonial period, the world that had produced stocks, pillories, and public confessions had largely given way to new systems of governance. But the memory of that earlier world did not disappear. It became part of the cultural imagination. Later writers, historians, and storytellers would return to it repeatedly, sometimes with criticism, sometimes with fascination, sometimes with cautionary reflection. The image of Puritan punishment became a symbol of strict moral order taken to extremes. Yet it also served as a reminder of how communities attempt to preserve cohesion in uncertain times. Looking back across the entire journey, from the earliest settlements to the fatting of old punishments, a broader pattern emerges. Puritan America was not defined by punishment alone. It was defined by the attempt to build structure in a difficult world. Punishment was one tool among many, used to enforce rules, maintain stability, and express shared values. But it was never separate from the society that created it. It reflected that society's fears, beliefs, and priorities. As those priorities changed, so did the punishments. And as the punishments changed, so did the society. In the end, the story is not only about what people did to those who broke the rules. It is about what those rules reveal about the people who made them. Their hopes, their anxieties, their sense of order, and their vision of what a community should be. The strange punishments of Puritan America may now seem distant, even unfamiliar, but they remain an important reminder that justice is never fixed. It evolves with time. It reflects its environment, and it always carries the imprint of the society that creates it. With that understanding, our journey through this world of strict laws, public shame, and moral discipline comes to its quiet conclusion, not as an ending of history itself, but as the closing of one chapter in the long and continuing story of how human beings try to live together, even after the formal systems of Puritan punishment had faded. Their echoes continued to surface in unexpected places. In court records from later colonial years, you can still find traces of older thinking language that feels inherited from a stricter time, when moral behavior and legal order were tightly bound together. The terminology softened, but the instincts remained familiar. Communities still cared deeply about reputation. Authorities still believed public order required visible consequences, and ordinary people still understood that social standing could shift quickly based on rumor, accusation, or public judgment. What had changed was not the concern itself, but the intensity of its enforcement. By the mid to late 18th century, punishment in New England and the wider American colonies had become more standardized. Jails were used more consistently. Fines were calculated more systematically. Legal procedures became increasingly formalized, relying on written documentation rather than communal memory. In earlier Puritan towns, justice had often been immediate and personal. Everyone knew the accused. Everyone knew the victim. Everyone witnessed the consequences. Now, justice was becoming something more distant, more procedural, less theatrical. This shift created both benefits and challenges. On one hand, it reduced the influence of emotion and local bias in certain cases. On the other hand, it weakened the direct communal involvement that had once defined enforcement. The town square was no longer the center of justice in the same way. The courtroom had taken its place, yet even as punishment became more structured, the cultural idea of moral accountability remained deeply rooted. Public reputation still mattered in employment, trade, and social relationships. Church communities still maintained expectations of behavior. Families still enforced discipline within the household. In many ways, the structure had changed, but the underlying pressure of social judgment had simply moved into different spaces. One of the most interesting developments in this period was the gradual separation between legal punishment and moral correction. In Puritan America, these two ideas were often indistinguishable. A crime was a sin. A punishment was a form of moral restoration. By the 18th century, however, legal systems increasingly treated offenses as civil matters rather than spiritual failures. This did not eliminate moral interpretation entirely, but it reduced its direct influence on formal punishment. Courts focused more on evidence, procedure, and consistency. Religious institutions continued addressing moral behavior, but their authority over civil punishment weakened. This separation marked a major turning point in the evolution of American justice. It created space for more pluralistic interpretations of behavior. It also introduced new tensions between personal belief and public law. Another long-term consequence of the Puritan system was the development of a strong cultural emphasis on discipline, even after public punishments declined. Ideas about self-control, responsibility, and moral order remained influential. These values were transmitted through education, family life, and religious practice. They became embedded in broader cultural expectations. In some ways, the external punishments of earlier centuries transformed into internal expectations, where once behavior was enforced through public shame, it was increasingly regulated through personal conscience and social norms. This shift is subtle but significant. It represents a move from external enforcement to internal regulation, from visible punishment to internalized standards, from communal spectacle to personal accountability. Of course, this transition was neither uniform nor complete. Different regions changed at different speeds. Different communities retained different traditions, and many older practices persisted in modified forms well into the 18th century. But the overall direction was clear. The most theatrical elements of Puritan punishment were slowly being replaced by systems that emphasized structure over spectacle. Looking back from a modern perspective, it is easy to focus on the strangeness of earlier punishments. The stocks, the pillory, public confessions, banishment, even the more extreme episodes of moral enforcement. But to understand them fully, it is important to see them not as isolated curiosities, but as part of a coherent social system, a system built around a specific understanding of community, survival, and order. In that system, punishment was not simply about retribution. It was about maintaining balance in a fragile environment. A small settlement could not easily absorb persistent disorder. Cooperation was essential. Trust was essential. Shared values were essential. Punishment, therefore, functioned as a mechanism to reinforce those necessities. Over time, as conditions changed, that mechanism evolved. The same society that once relied heavily on public shame gradually shifted toward more formal legal structures. The same communities that once gathered in town squares to witness punishment later relied on courts and written law. The same moral framework that once justified public humiliation eventually adapted into more private forms of discipline. What remains striking is not just how different the systems were, but how familiar the underlying concerns still feel. Order, fairness, responsibility, community stability. These themes continue to shape discussions about justice today. Even modern legal debates often circle back to questions that Puritan society grappled with in its own way. How should wrongdoing be addressed? What is the purpose of punishment? How much should society intervene in individual behavior? And where should the boundary lie between personal freedom and collective responsibility? These questions have no final answers. They shift with time culture, and circumstance. That is why the history of punishment remains relevant, not because it provides solutions, but because it reveals patterns. Patterns of fear and control, patterns of adaptation and reform, patterns of how societies respond when they feel their stability is threatened. Puritan America represents one chapter in that longer story, a chapter shaped by conviction, uncertainty, and a strong desire to create order in an unpredictable world. Its punishments may appear strange from a modern standpoint, but they were never arbitrary. They were expressions of a worldview that placed enormous weight on visible behavior, communal judgment, and moral discipline. As that worldview changed, so too did its systems of enforcement. And as those systems faded, they left behind both caution and insight. Caution about the power of collective fear, and insight into how deeply societies can shape the behavior of individuals through shared belief. With that, the journey through the strange punishments of Puritan America reaches its final reflection, not as a conclusion to history, but as a closing look at how one society tried, sometimes rigidly, sometimes harshly, always seriously, to hold itself together, and how, over time, that effort transformed into something more complex, more restrained, and more familiar to the world that followed. By this point in the story, the world of Puritan punishment no longer exists as it once did, but its outlines still linger in the way later societies organized themselves. The wooden frames in village squares have long been removed. The public gatherings that once surrounded shame-based punishment have disappeared. The strict overlap between church discipline and civil law has been largely separated into different institutions. Yet something quieter has remained behind, a structure of expectations, a sense that behavior is not entirely private, and a long-standing belief that communities have the right, sometimes the responsibility, to respond when rules are broken. In the generations that followed, American legal systems continued to evolve, but they did not emerge in a vacuum. They carried forward assumptions shaped during the earliest colonial period. Even when the methods changed, the underlying questions persisted. What should society do with those who break its rules? How should order be maintained? And how should punishment balance correction, deterrence, and fairness? These questions had been answered one way in Puritan New England. They would be answered differently in later centuries, but they would never disappear. One of the most significant long-term shifts was the rise of institutional justice. In earlier Puritan communities, punishment was deeply visible and communal. Everyone participated in witnessing consequences. Everyone understood who had been punished and why. Over time, justice became more centralized. Professional roles developed. Judges, clerks, and legal officials began to replace the informal authority of local congregations and town leaders. This professionalization changed the character of punishment itself. It became less personal, less emotionally immediate, and more standardized. At the same time, incarceration gradually replaced public humiliation as the dominant form of punishment. Prisons were not a Puritan invention, but their use expanded significantly in the centuries after the colonial period. Confinement replaced spectacle. Isolation replaced public shame. Regulation replaced ritual display. This shift reflected changing ideas about human behavior, rather than assuming that public embarrassment was the most effective deterrent. Later systems emphasized controlled environments designed for containment, labor, or reform. But even as punishment moved indoors, so to speak, the legacy of earlier systems continued to influence cultural thinking. Public reputation still mattered. Social consequences still followed wrongdoing. Communities still reacted strongly to perceived moral violations. The difference was that these reactions were no longer formalized into public legal spectacle. They existed in a more diffuse cultural space. Another important development was the gradual expansion of legal rights and procedural protections. In earlier colonial systems, especially during moments of fear or crisis, legal safeguards could weaken significantly. The Salem episode is the most famous example of this collapse under pressure. In later systems, greater emphasis was placed on evidence standards, legal representation, and structured procedures. These changes did not eliminate injustice, but they created more consistent frameworks for evaluating accusations. Over time, the idea that punishment should follow established rules became more central than the idea that punishment should serve immediate moral demonstration. This evolution reflects a broader transformation in how societies think about authority. In Puritan America, authority was often seen as moral and collective. In later systems, authority became more procedural and institutional. Both models aim to maintain order, but they differ in how they define legitimacy. The Puritan model drew legitimacy from shared belief and communal enforcement. The modern model draws legitimacy from formal process and codified law. Yet the transition between these systems was gradual and uneven. Elements of both continued to coexist for a long time. Even today, traces of communal moral judgment still appear alongside formal legal processes. Public opinion, media attention, and social reaction can sometimes amplify or reshape the impact of legal punishment. In that sense, the boundary between Puritan-style public accountability and modern institutional justice is not as absolute as it might first appear. What has changed is the mechanism, not the underlying dynamic. Another enduring legacy lies in the cultural memory of Puritan severity. Over centuries, the image of strict discipline, public punishment, and moral rigidity became part of how later generations interpreted early American history. It was sometimes exaggerated, sometimes simplified, but it persisted as a recognizable theme. That image has influenced literature, education, and popular storytelling. It has become shorthand for a society defined by rules and restraint. Yet beneath that simplified image lies a more complex reality. Puritan communities were not solely defined by punishment. They were also shaped by cooperation, survival, religious devotion, and a strong sense of shared purpose. Punishment was only one element of a broader social system, a system designed to maintain cohesion in environments that were often uncertain and demanding. Understanding that context does not require approval, but it does require nuance, because without context, the punishments can appear random or purely harsh. With context, they become part of a larger attempt to solve a difficult problem. How to build order in a fragile world. As we reach the final reflection of this long journey, the story of Puritan punishment becomes less about specific devices or episodes, and more about transformation. Transformation of law, transformation of society, transformation of belief. The stocks and pillories are gone. The public confessions are gone. The formal banishments are rare. But the questions they raised continue to echo. How should communities respond to harm? How much visibility should punishment have? What is the relationship between morality and law? And how does a society balance control with freedom? These are not questions confined to the 17th century. They are ongoing questions, shaped differently in each era. The strange punishments of Puritan America, when viewed through this lens, are not simply historical curiosities. They are early expressions of enduring tensions in human society, tensions that continue to evolve but never fully disappear. And that is where this journey ultimately comes to rest, not in the disappearance of punishment itself, but in its continual transformation alongside the societies that create it. A reminder that justice is never static. It is always shaped by the world around it, and always, in some way, shaped by fear, belief, and the desire for order. Even after the Puritan framework of punishment had largely dissolved, its influence continued to surface in quieter, less obvious ways across American society, not in the form of wooden stocks or public confessions, but in attitudes, expectations, and cultural instincts that had been carried forward through generations. The idea that behavior should be visible and accountable never fully disappeared. It simply changed its expression. In later centuries, communities still responded strongly to misconduct, but the stage shifted. The town square became the newspaper page. The public confession became the statement of apology. The pillory became, in some cases, social exclusion rather than physical restraint. Shame remained, but its mechanisms evolved. This transformation reflects a broader truth about how societies change. Rarely do systems vanish completely. More often, they adapt. Old structures are replaced by new ones that serve similar purposes in different forms. The Puritan emphasis on moral order, for example, did not end with the decline of their formal religious governance. Instead, it helped shape cultural norms around discipline, responsibility, and public conduct that persisted in American life long after. One of the most enduring legacies is the belief in personal accountability as a public matter. Even today, discussions about wrongdoing often extend beyond legal consequences into social judgment, public opinion, reputation, and communal response continue to play a role in how behavior is evaluated. While modern systems emphasize legal procedure and individual rights far more strongly than colonial systems ever did, the social dimension of accountability remains present. Another lasting influence is the connection between morality and governance. Puritan society did not separate the two. Law and religious expectation were intertwined. Over time, these spheres became more distinct, especially in modern democratic systems. But debates about morality in public policy still reflect echoes of that older relationship. Questions about what should be regulated, what should be tolerated, and what should be considered private behavior continue to surface in political and cultural discussions. These debates are not direct continuations of Puritan law, but they exist in a historical continuum shaped by earlier assumptions about community responsibility. Another important legacy is the concept of social conformity as a stabilizing force. Puritan communities placed a high value on shared norms. Deviation was often treated not simply as difference, but as potential disruption, while modern societies tend to place greater emphasis on pluralism and individual expression. Tensions still exist between conformity and diversity. Every society negotiates this balance in its own way. The Puritan experience represents one of the earliest structured attempts in North America to manage that tension through formal and informal systems of control. As those systems changed, the tension itself did not disappear. It simply shifted into new forms of negotiation. One of the most striking aspects of this history is how deeply environmental conditions shaped legal and moral structures. Early New England was a place of uncertainty. Harsh weather, limited resources, and isolated settlements created conditions where cooperation was essential for survival. In such an environment, strict social regulation could be seen as necessary rather than excessive. Over time, as conditions stabilized, those same structures began to feel less essential. What once functioned as survival mechanism gradually became tradition, and eventually, in some cases, restriction. This pattern is not unique to Puritan America. It appears in many societies across history, systems designed for stability in one context often outlive the conditions that created them. When that happens, societies face the challenge of adaptation. The gradual replacement of public punishment with institutional justice reflects exactly such a process. It is not a sudden break from the past, but a long adjustment to new realities. By examining this transition, we gain insight not only into Puritan America, but into the broader dynamics of social evolution. Punishment systems are never just about crime. They are about values. They are about fear and security. They are about how people imagine order in their communities. And they are about how those communities change when circumstances shift. In the case of Puritan New England, the shift was slow but profound. What began as a tightly controlled moral society gradually evolved into something more diverse, more complex, and more institutionally structured. The visible punishments that once defined public life became less central, replaced by systems that operated with greater distance and formality. Yet the underlying concerns never fully disappeared. Order still mattered. Behavior still mattered. Community still mattered. What changed was how those concerns were expressed. As we reach the final reflection of this extended journey, it becomes clear that the story of Puritan punishment is not simply a story about severity or control. It is a story about adaptation, about how human societies respond to uncertainty, about how they construct systems to manage behavior, and about how those systems evolve when the world around them changes. The strange punishments that once took place in village squares and meeting houses now belong to history, but the questions they were designed to answer remain very much alive. How should societies balance freedom and order? How should they respond to harm? And how should justice reflect the values of its time? These questions do not have final answers. They are revisited by every generation in new circumstances. And in that sense, the world of Puritan America is not as distant as it first appears. It is part of a continuing conversation about how people live together, govern themselves, and define what it means to live in a just society. That conversation continues long after the wooden frames have vanished, long after the sermons have ended, and long after the Puritan world itself has faded into memory. And it is within that ongoing conversation that the true legacy of these strange punishments can still be understood. The sun is beginning to set on our long journey through the strange punishments of Puritan America. The village roads that were once crowded with farmers, magistrates, church elders, and curious neighbors now seem quiet. The meeting houses stand still. The wooden stocks sit empty. The pillories have weathered under countless seasons of rain and snow. The voices that once argued, accused, confessed, and judged have long since faded into history. Yet their world has left traces behind. For more than 100 years, The Puritans attempted something remarkable. They tried to create a society where religious belief, law, morality, and daily life functioned as a single system, every rule connected to a larger purpose, every punishment connected to a larger vision. They believed that a community could only survive if its members shared common values and accepted common responsibilities. Looking back, it is easy to focus on the punishments themselves, the public humiliations, the forced confessions, the banishments, the visible signs of shame, the unusual devices designed to make examples of offenders. These punishments appear strange because they belong to a world very different from our own. But beneath the surface, the people administering those punishments were confronting challenges that every society eventually faces. How do you maintain order? How do you encourage cooperation? How do you protect a community from behaviors considered harmful? And perhaps most difficult of all, how do you balance individual freedom against collective stability? The Puritans answered those questions with remarkable certainty. Their answers were often strict. Sometimes they were harsh. Occasionally, they produced tragic consequences. Yet those answers made sense within the environment they inhabited. A fragile settlement surrounded by uncertainty could not easily tolerate disorder. A community facing disease, crop failures, frontier conflicts, and harsh winters often valued unity above personal independence. The survival of the group frequently outweighed the preferences of the individual. That reality shaped every aspect of Puritan punishment. Over time, however, the world changed. Trade expanded. Populations grew. New ideas arrived. Different religious traditions spread across the colonies. Economic opportunities increased. The tight-knit villages of the 17th century gradually became part of a larger and more complicated society. As conditions changed, the old systems no longer fit as neatly as they once had. Punishments that had seemed necessary began to feel excessive. Rules that had once protected social cohesion began to appear restrictive. Communities adapted. Institutions evolved. The methods of enforcement changed. Yet history rarely erases itself completely. The Puritan world may have disappeared, but its influence lingered. It shaped ideas about responsibility. It shaped ideas about public behavior. It shaped ideas about morality and accountability. Even today, echoes of those debates remain visible whenever societies discuss justice, social expectations, public conduct, and the responsibilities individuals owe to one another. That may be one of the most fascinating lessons hidden within this story. The punishments themselves have vanished. The questions behind them have not. Every generation inherits those questions. Every generation answers them differently. And every generation believes, at least for a time, that its answers are the correct ones. The Puritans believed that too, just as later generations would, just as future generations likely will. History reminds us that certainty is often temporary. What seems obvious in one century may appear strange in another. What seems normal today may puzzle historians hundreds of years from now. And so, as the evening settles over the old villages of New England, the story slowly comes to rest. The church bells grow quiet, the roads empty, lantern light glows faintly through small windows. Families gather around fireplaces. The long day ends, the long century ends, and eventually the Puritan world itself fades into the pages of history. But the lessons remain, not because the punishments were unusual, not because the laws were strict, but because they reveal something timeless about human nature. Our desire for order, our fear of chaos, our willingness to create rules, and our constant struggle to decide where justice should begin and where it should end. The strange punishments of Puritan America have finally reached their conclusion. Thank you for joining this journey through one of the most unusual chapters in early American history. If you want to continue the journey, the next video is waiting.